When studying English for the first time, have you ever wondered why such a language needs tenses? Why can't people simply use one verb for everything? After all, if someone says, I eat, I ate, or I will eat, aren't they all talking about the same action, which is eating?
So why did English become so complicated? Well, the answer lies deep in history. And surprisingly, tenses are not just random grammar rules invented to make English difficult. They evolved over thousands of years because people needed a more precise way to communicate. Let's find out why.
Long before English even existed, people in Europe spoke an ancient language that linguists today call Proto-Indo-European. This language was spoken roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago by people who lived across the Eurasian steppes. Although no written records of it survive, modern linguists have reconstructed much of its grammar by comparing hundreds of related languages. As communities spread across Europe and parts of Asia, Proto-Indo-European gradually evolved into many different language families. One of them became Proto-Germanic, the ancestor of English, German, Dutch, and several Scandinavian languages. Interestingly, the earliest Germanic languages had a much simpler tense system than modern English. They mainly distinguished between two ideas: actions happening now and actions that had already happened. In other words, they had something similar to a present tense and a past tense. There was no special future tense. If people wanted to talk about the future, they simply used context, or words that meant later, tomorrow, or soon. As centuries passed, the language that would eventually become English continued to change. Old English, spoken from around the 5th to the 11th century, inherited this relatively simple tense system. However, England experienced waves of invasions and cultural influence from the Vikings and later the Normans. These events introduced thousands of new words, new expressions, and new ways of constructing sentences. Instead of creating dozens of new verb endings like Latin or Spanish, English developed another solution. It began combining main verbs with helping verbs, also called auxiliary verbs. Words such as be, have, will, and do gradually took on important grammatical roles. This approach allowed English speakers to describe time with much greater precision without dramatically changing the main verb itself. But this raises another question. If English originally had only simple ways to describe time, why did it eventually develop so many tenses? The answer is simple. Because humans don't just talk about when something happens. Imagine these three sentences. I write, I am writing, I have written. All three involve the same action, writing, but they communicate very different ideas. The first describes a general fact or habit. The second tells us the action is happening right now. The third explains that the action has already been completed, while its result is still important. Without these distinctions, conversations would become far less precise. Listeners would constantly need to ask follow-up questions just to understand exactly what the speaker meant. This is where tenses become incredibly useful. At their core, tenses help organize information in time. They answer questions like, did it happen before? Is it happening now? Will it happen later? Has it already been completed? Was it still happening at a particular moment? These distinctions may seem small, but they help speakers create a clear timeline inside the listener's mind. Think of tenses as a map of time. Instead of simply pointing to an event, they tell us exactly where that event belongs in relation to the present. In fact, many linguists explain that English tenses do more than indicate time. They also express what grammar experts call aspect, the way an action unfolds over time. For example, saying she studied simply reports a completed action. But saying she was studying paints an entirely different picture. It suggests the action was in progress at a particular moment in the past. Likewise, she has studied tells us that the action is complete, but its result still matters now. Notice that the difference is not just about time, it is about perspective. English allows speakers to zoom in on an action, zoom out from it, or connect it to another point in time. That flexibility makes communication more accurate and often more expressive. This is why tenses remain one of the foundations of English grammar. Without them, speakers could still communicate basic ideas. However, expressing details, telling stories, explaining scientific discoveries, describing historical events, or discussing future plans would become much more confusing. Imagine reading a novel where every verb stayed exactly the same. You would constantly struggle to know whether events had already happened, were happening now, or would happen later. Tenses solve that problem before it even begins. So, are English tenses really necessary? From a historical perspective, they developed naturally as English evolved and as speakers needed more precise ways to describe events. From a practical perspective, they help us communicate not only when something happens, but also how it happens, whether it is finished, ongoing, repeated, or connected to another moment in time. In other words, tenses are not obstacles created for language learners. They are tools that make communication clearer, richer, and far more efficient. And once you understand why they exist, learning them no longer feels like memorizing random grammar rules. Instead, it becomes a way of understanding how English speakers organize time itself.